Welcome to Spiritual Study Session 47. This session is on consciousness and its relation to modern day physics and in relation to age-old spirituality. What do ancient traditions and modern traditions have to say on this subject? And why is it an upcoming fascination and debate within quantum physics? There is no way to quell this topic within the time allotted. We are going to be exploring the topic, and I'll start with a personal definition. In my experience, what I call moments of consciousness are times of stepping outside of the situation that you're living, almost like a third person perspective. These can be times of tremendous grief where you stand outside of yourself. These can be moments of deja vu like recollection where you realize how you've gotten to where you are. You see yourself as the other, as a part, per se. Moments of consciousness can also come in groups. Sometimes to step outside of a group and to feel a tremendous sense of belonging, or to perceive the intertwining beauty of how you have all managed to come together in this space. Also, there's a lot to say of group consciousness. So that is on more of the experiential level. But this discussion is spiritual, is philosophical, epistemological, phenomenological, etymological, and of course, where we'll begin is it's now a matter of physics. So when it comes to entertaining this new discussion in physics, the belief is that consciousness is a manifestation of quantum processes in the brain, that on this deep level, if only it can be observed correctly, one could find the root or the phenomena of consciousness. Otherwise, there are contingent beliefs, such as matter and consciousness are dual aspects of one fundamental reality. The search of physics began with the neurological search for the part of the brain that is responsible for consciousness, awareness. However, there was seemingly no where. So they kept going deeper and are now attempting to pin it within quantum phenomena, which at the very least will involve different revelations. Now, you could say that this fascination very much came to the forefront with the double slit experiment, of which we discussed previously in the course, to say that the act of observing was changing the phenomena of waves or particles. So what is it to say? What is the consciousness doing? What is the act of witnessing doing? How does that infiltrate, change, alter reality? You can see the soupy waters of this session right now. So with this brings up questions of a philosophical variety within physics, which is free will and determinism. If there is such a thing as quantum randomness, then it would be to say that there is free will. However, if randomness is the case, then there is no goal directed volition, there is no aim. Or is it also to say that the things within the field of quanta are all preset, but would seem random only with our lack of know-how? So you can see these are epistemological, which is a reference to what does it mean to know? What are the metaphysical bases that we are using to approach this subject? Which what we choose on that level will dictate our solution or our answers to the question of consciousness. Are these phenomena of the quantum world statistic? And if so, then determined. And we see deviation on this subject, whether we're talking Schrodinger, Planck, Bohr, this conflict between determinism and free will, which is not purely a matter of physics. This is a philosophical debate that's been going on for a long time. The Greeks had a time with this one. The empirists and the empiricists and the rationalists of the late Enlightenment, and spiritual traditions. We've seen in this course, for instance, the Norse being very convinced of determinism, that everything's sent, versus, say, the Christians that would claim free will while maintaining a trope of the divine plan, seemingly contradictingly. But when it comes to physics, the one of the points of fascination are these microtubuli. And this is something that is propounded by, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name right now, but these particular neurofilaments and microtubuli of the neurological brain at its quantum level is said to be correlated, keyword, correlated to consciousness. However, in this search of nailing it down, this seems like yet another peg up the ladder. And then there is the quantum field theory. Now, this is interesting to me because it's to say that there are a finite amount of options that the field can perform. At certain times, it would seem that the field does what is called spontaneous symmetry breaking. Spontaneous meaning that we can't quite understand why it does so. Now, likened to the phenomena that you feel, the vibes, maybe we could liken to disharmonious states as a breaking in the quantum symmetry, whereas all manner and flavors of harmonious states are when the quantum field is in symmetry. Now, what causes this break of symmetry is another interesting question. That the field of quanta may be a strange analogy of our own ineffable self. And this field theory is not far from different spiritual traditions, which one of the leading philosophical scientific approaches to this modern quantum debacle is panpsychism. Panpsychism, which is that a theory that maintains that all things maintain an aspect of mind. All things fundamentally have an aspect of mind or thought or psyche or consciousness. This would be propounded by philosophers and spiritualists alike. Most notably, Spinoza and Leibniz are going to be the ones that are really taking this on. And these are, man. So, what is panpsychism? Pan, meaning all, everything, whole, psyche, the soul, the mind, or another reference to psyche, the breath. So, everything is living. Now, when I say this, or when modern physicists are saying this is animism. This is shamanism. This is the original spirituality, that everything is spirit. Now, if I use the word spirit, that hits the mind different based off of cultural propagation than if I were to say psyche. Psyche is more acceptable, but psyche is simply an alone word for soul. Or if I say mind, what does the mind mean? Well, if we dial it back, it's soul, it's spirit. It's what the ancients called soul or spirit. So, my question here is this new? And the answer is no. It's not new. So, let's look at the etymology of the term conscious and subsequently consciousness. So, to be conscious is taking from Latin con, meaning with, and scare, which is to know, which this scare is the root of the term science. Science means to know, a loan word from the Greek syneidos. So with knowing, that's what it means to be conscious. If you are awake, you are knowing. And this is how it was originally intended, to be perceiving within oneself, to be sensibly, inwardly aware. So there's this flavor of inwardly, to witness yourself. What is this witnessing of oneself? Is this fundamental question of this topic? If we are merely sensational creatures, we do off of impulse alone. But the predicament of the consciousness is that we are aware of our doing. And that is where we can sign ourselves up for an endless refraction of mirrors. And what I mean by that is that I know that I know that I know that I know that I know, to the point of confusion, inaction, and indecision. And notice this word, conscious, is as early as 1600. This is a newer word. Okay, so 1600, what was happening? Oh, this is the Enlightenment era. This is the beginning of the separation of the church. And I know that's a shifty topic, but there was no use of this word in this way in the past because we had another word, spirit and soul, which are the same. So notice how contemporary the word conscious and consciousness is. And speaking of consciousness, the state of being aware of what passes through one's own mind, to be privy to your thoughts. This is coming up in the 1630s. So you are, as a conscious being or as a soul-bearing being, aware of what has happened to you and are aware of what stimuli present themselves to you, and by extension, your own surroundings. Now, what's the twist on this? As soon as I say altered states of consciousness, where do our connotations go? Now, most notably with the drug wars, we are hesitant, right? We have a poor association with this word altered states. And it's just because of that. Because altered is not a negative word. Altered is simply the root of the word alternate, another way of being conscious, a different consciousness, a different presentation of sensory phenomena, which is wild if you think about it, that that's even possible. So, how one achieves altered, what are referred to as altered states of consciousness, alternative states of consciousness. Well, this is what spirituality, animism, shamanism, paganism, all manner of spiritual traditions do differently. Whether it's prayer, whether it's dance, whether it's meditation, yoga, or sacred medicine, or what this modern era would like to call drugs. Now, if we are going to play into that game, then what we believe is correct is pharmaceutical medications in place of mental illness, and not getting to the root of where these mental illnesses come from, but treating them as symptomatic, treating the symptoms, and not getting to the root systemic, perhaps even soul level issues, right? The perspective, right? And we only will use the medication that has been regulated, created, synthesized through a lab, although all these medications come from plants. They all come from plants. And if you want to know more about this, go to the spirituality of plants topic. But, you know, aspirin, bark of the willow, right? I mean, on and on and on and on. All these things come from plants, that plants are all the medicine in the world. It all comes from plants. And so then comes the controversial topic of hallucinogens, psychedelics, that, and now only recently, only very recently, has the lid started to boil over on this topic of treating otherwise untreatable conditions by use of plant medicine, whether it's Cabo or different brews of tea, say ayahuasca or psilocybin, that these through research have been found to treat, let's do a list: eating disorders, addictions, trauma, depressions. They have shown through study to increase neurological function, and a notable furthering attribute of openness within those who have been studied, an improvement of their mental health. So, altered consciousness, altered states of consciousness, maybe throughout history, spiritual traditions have been onto something about the healthiness, the need to achieve what we call altered states of consciousness, that one needs to perceive differently, to see differently, that perhaps one lens of looking at the world is toxic and neurotic. Okay, I'm getting heated already. So let's jump out of that for a bit and start looking at this a bit differently. And I want to look at Sufism or Sufism. And this is something I haven't got to mention much in the course. But there's this term that I'm not going to be saying frequently because we all know how good I am at pronunciations, but it's W-A-J-D or it's W-U-J-U-D, wajd. That's the one time I'll try to say it. The etymological root meaning of this word is being, existence, and finding. So I'm going to use the word being as the substitute in English. So there are different types of being within this tradition. The being of prophets is one of them. The realization of highest consciousness, being on the third person perspective, a omnipresent perspective, a getting out of oneself, a being of prophets is the coined term. The being of saints, which is a state of calm, of bliss, of being at peace, likened to a meditative enlightenment. There's a being of dervishes, This is the rhythmic motion of the body. Okay, where do we find this? In the dance of the ancient shamanic and paganistic traditions to achieve an altered state of being. There's the being of idealists. And this is the dramatic, the grief or the euphoric sense of bodily threshold. This could be supreme happiness or supreme sadness, tears, joy. And then the being of devotees. And this, yet again, is a similar but not quite the same exalted state of the physical and mental body, the absolute heightened summit of physical sensation and stimuli. These are all different beings that are within the spiritual tradition. Now, do we understand this being, this wajd, this existence and finding as a synonym for consciousness? Perhaps. Perhaps, too, it's a synonym for perception. Perhaps, too, it's a synonym for awareness. And perhaps all these things are different sides of the die. Perhaps we can call it attainment, an attainment of a specific, significant inward sensation, phenomena, perspective. And how do we propagate this is an interesting question. How does this come to be? Because the concrete world, in unpredictable ways at time, can knock you out of yourself. Again, like I said in the beginning, maybe through grief, maybe through bliss, maybe through being around other people. These strange moments of deja vu, or you being snapped into yourself, suddenly very aware. But in these different ways of being, these are different ways of propagating these feelings. Rhythmic motion, meditation, yoga. I mean, these are not the way, but they're a way. They are different means of achieving a certain state of consciousness, or teasing out the consciousness or the soul or the spirit. Oh. Now, when it's mentioned of what God is, and this is a fascinating subject here, it is that he is known and the object of awareness, and that he is immutable and self-realized. So this is really me stepping out on a leg here, but it's just a maybe, just an idea. But maybe to certain people throughout history, or to certain traditions, God is consciousness. That when you are one with God, or when you are in communion with God, that these are moments of realizing third person perspective yourself, a higher vantage point view of what otherwise would have been a autonomic, an autonomous, you know, self-pilot, without realization. Autopilot is what I was looking for. That maybe, whether it's different pagan traditions imbibing a god, embodying, or whether it's the Christians in having a revelatory communion with God, that these are moments of succinct consciousness. And likewise, nirvana, enlightenment, divinity, all these things. What if it's all about these sharp moments of poignant consciousness, knowing, lack of a better term? So these different ways within Sufism, or Sufism. I'm not even sure if I'm saying that right. These different states of being, you know? What are other ways? Okay, receiving bad news could be a way to knock you into this state of being, this wajt. A longing for someone else, an absence of something, that something's gone, perhaps a death. What does death do to you? It might make you reflect on what life is all about and what's important. This would be a moment of stepping into yourself. Another way of being is by witnessing the heart, witnessing hurt or joy or love. Witnessing could be a moment of stepping outside of your autopilot, stepping outside of unconscious drives of pure instinct. Another way of being or attaining this being is overwhelming, to become overwhelmed by something, whether it's weeping or whether it's beauty. To be overwhelmed is another means of achieving being. You know, that you might find yourself at a complete loss in a state of ruin, and this is where you find a state of being. And so it's interesting here because, yet again, all these alternative terminologies, witnessing, perception, you know, what's the difference between being or finding and witnessing? You know, it seems like such a um, semantic jumble. How can we distinguish the difference between just simply witnessing and finding? Now, there was a saying that if one can say the word dates without tasting the sweetness in their mouth, then they weren't really witnessing dates or weren't really saying dates. That there's a savoring that comes along with all states of being, that if you were truly there, it would involve the sensation. You know, if you are talking about a loss that you've experienced in life, you ought to still feel that loss. And this could be a difference in witnessing and finding. That simply witnessing might not include the living part of it, but finding would seem to be an involvement with whatever sensation or is being recollected or experienced. So to hop out of that for a little bit, you know, it's an interesting philosophical and spiritual and linguistic wormhole. But I want to look at a little bit of this rhythmic motion state of beingness, right? I've mentioned, I mean, it speaks to these different states of being within Sufism. That is the being of dervishes and the being of devotees, the state of exalted mental and physical faculties, of the state of motion, achieving this, of rhythmic motion, of dance, of enthralling your body and psyche. And I want to point to what I talked about last week in the course, which is the Dionysian mysteries that would lead to Orphism. And what did they do in the Dionysian mysteries? They used intoxicants and ecstatic dance and music to achieve higher states of being. And see, here I'm using higher states of being instead of altered states of being, right? And again, point to go witness a tribe across the world, and these dancing ceremonies, these songs, these drums, this rhythmic motion is the being of dervishes and devotees, is a means and faculty of consciousness seen throughout different spiritual traditions. And likewise, to approach it differently, forms of meditation, whether it's transcendental or you know, of a different tradition, you know, call it God, there's so many different names, but you know, to take the time to rest within yourself, to repeat a mantra, to simply just calm, or to do a mental visualization to go within your imagination, or again, hearkening to the shamanic tradition, is to take the shamanic journey to go within yourself and commune with your spirit animal or the ancestors. These are all different moments of you taking the time to achieve a different state of consciousness, of being. You're in the same place, but you're not in the same place. This is real trippy territory. And to step out of anxiety, to step out of this ADHD neuroticism, would be to intentionally use and facilitate consciousness. Now, in this subject, there are a lot of wooey leads, for all these new age traditions that are like, raise the consciousness, raise the vibration, achieve Christ consciousness, so let's talk about at least that a little bit. As far as I can tell, this aspect of Christ consciousness is really either coined or very much proliferated by Edgar Casey. And it's this way of this apparent birthright of returning to God, as it's put, that we are not simply flesh and blood, that we are spiritual beings inhabiting a vessel, which is a part of many different spiritual traditions. And that this is all a means to return to what was lost in the garden, which is this state of absolute consciousness. This is the way that the story is presented. That the end of times, or the revelation, is not to escape the earth, but it is to bring spirit, or i.e., consciousness, to the planet and transmute the whole situation by dissolving fear and misunderstanding, by full frontal, full on, everyone, everything spirit. And this approach, this mindfulness, this state of being is Christ consciousness, that a person can attain this state of being, which again was one of the ways of being within Sufism. It was the way, the being of prophets, the realization of the highest consciousness. That God and mankind, that mankind was created in the image of the Creator, right? So you point to Luke 15:11 through 24, right? We were with God in the beginning, and through the power of our free will, we were able to make the choice that to be in a perfect accordance with the Creator. That we will return to this. Or look at John 17:16, that Jesus says, "They are not of the world, even as I am not of the world." So what is meant by that? That this is the achieving of the exterior perspective, of the knocking of the conscious state, of the higher vantage point, as if you are looking at it third person, omnipresent, bringing a state of unity, omniscience, and bliss, of understanding, of knowing, of gnosis, of becoming a Kabbalist, of reaching nirvana, of achieving moksha. I mean, what language would you like me to use? Now, to kind of point the finger more at Christianity's relationship with this topic, I want to bring up something that doesn't get brought up enough, and that is Montanism. Montanus was a monk around 150 to 170. and was said to have a gift of speaking in tongues, or in another verbiage, glossolalia, that this gift or this state of being was thought to have been being one with the Holy Spirit, to claim that he was the Father and the Son and the Paraclete, which is a very old reference, but I'm not going to get into that right now. And that this movement was all around, again, early Christian movement that I haven't got to mention, was all around these ecstatic experiences, that these revelations could come involuntarily or voluntarily into a person that would achieve a state of Christ consciousness, whatever you want to call it. And just as a side note, this is a movement within early Christianity that was very much aligned with discussion that we had previously about, the history of women in early Christianity. This movement held up two women very strongly, Maximilia and Priscilla, or Prisca, depending. And, anyway, that's a side note. However, what would happen to the Montanist? Well, if you know what Christianity's done with many of its alternatives, I don't need to say it, but it's just something I wanted to point out, that this is a state of ecstatic wonderment. This is a state of frenzy, of blabbling, of utterly losing, not losing, but an alternate state of being. That, how does that come about? I mean, modernly speaking, they would claim that this is a form of psychosis, but clearly we are not in a good standing, based off everything I'm saying today, to understand the nuances and the ineffableness of the question of consciousness. Now, also to continue pointing the finger at Christianity, Giordano Bruno, of which I've got to mention once in the course before. Here's a quote made in 1584. The universe is of infinite size, and the worlds therein without number. The worlds contained therein, such as earths, fires, and other species of body named stars, are infinite in number, and all move by the internal principle which is their own soul. It is vain to persist in seeking an extrinsic cause of their motion. Okay. This is a priest in the 1500s that is preaching panpsychism, as we mentioned in the beginning, and is throwing out, completely decimating the geocentric model. A Christian priest. That Bruno was deeply religious, believed heavily in God and magic, and is making what would otherwise seem to be a scientific statement. And just like Spinoza, just like Leibniz, we have Bruno here saying that God is within every part of the universe, or spirit or consciousness is within every part of the universe, that divinity is within us and in every other heavenly body, that God is the nature of all natures. Now, to go to various cosmogonies, the creator sits there at the beginning, whether we're talking paganism, what have you. And what is the creator doing? The creator's first thing is always that the creator is aware of the situation. That's the first thing. The second thing is the word. The word is the reverberation or the creation or the Big Bang, if we care to use that term. So what is the first thing then? The first thing is awareness. Awareness. And that this is the nature of all natures. The knowing. To take another quote from Bruno, God is the universal world soul, and that all particular material things are manifestations of one infinite principle. That God is the infinite infinity, the infinite in infinity, the everywhere and everything, neither above nor below, but absolutely present. Now, when I spoke of Leibniz and Spinoza, a while back, I made the argument for Spinoza that he was to say that everything is a radical subjectivity, that if nobody is looking at the house doesn't exist, that you being conscious of something creates the thing or perpetuates the existence of the thing. Now, if we choose to look at things poorly, then they will appear poorly. If we choose to look at things as if such poor things don't exist, there is nothing to perpetuate it. I use the example that if we all didn't, if we woke up tomorrow and said that money didn't exist, it wouldn't. If we all just woke up tomorrow and agreed that it wasn't a thing, it wouldn't be a thing. Everything is held up by the feeding of consciousness into the idea. Now, how did he explain that the house was still there even if nobody was looking? Well, he said it's because of God, and it seems like a throwaway term, but here let's just substitute the word consciousness. That if consciousness is within all things, that it is radical subjectivity, yet it would seem like the world is an objective place. So anyhow. Bruno was immediately disenfranchised as soon as he was ordained as a priest because of his irregular and outspoken views. And that, as the story goes, through many times of running away, he is eventually burned at the stake. He is killed by the church for what he's saying. Now, what does that say? Two, there's a point to look at here. The risk of consciousness, the risk of realizing what's going on, the risk of sticking your neck out there, of saying otherwise. And what does that say about the state of humanity? Now, this might seem like a very dark topic to bring up, and there's a lot of cynicism, worthy cynicism within this outlook. But here is the case, right? Where, and look at Jesus in the same extension, not to make too heavy of a tie between Bruno and Jesus, but I'm just saying, if you're going to use this canon, use this vernacular, Jesus was speaking out the truth, speaking out what was experienced within him. If you take him to be a literal person of the world, and what happens to him? People don't like that. People don't like that at all. And then dial the clock forward 1500 years. Here we have Bruno, has a realization, speaks out things. What happens to him? They kill him at the stake. And you could go through a laundry list of examples here. So consciousness, oh gosh, I'm just going to move on. Here's some quotes from Schrödinger. Consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms. Take a note here, physicists. Here's a physicist saying this. For consciousness is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else. Cutting, scathing stuff. Scathing. Here's another one. Aldous Huxley. Consciousness is only possible through change. Change is the only possible movement. Now, a long time ago, I did a talk on divination and palmistry. And one of the key ways, one of the key factors of learning palmistry is that you know that the will is what changes the character of the person. So on the non-dominant hand is the grid of what somebody would be if they never changed anything about themselves. And on the dominant hand, the difference between the two shows what the person has consciously changed about their life, changed about their habits, changed about their approach, changed about their perspective. So, consciousness is tied to change. That when things change, this is tied to achieving the state of being. So, facilitating altered states of consciousness through prayer, meditation, what have you, is a way of presenting change and is a way of facilitating consciousness. That the nature of all nature abhors stasis, abhors staticness, that it wants to DJ remix infinite. Another quote, Terence McKenna, "You are an explorer and you represent our species, and the greatest good you can do is to bring back a new idea because our world is endangered by the absence of good ideas. Our world is in crisis because of the absence of consciousness." A point that I've brought up several times throughout the course. Ask the shamans what's wrong with the world, where we went wrong as a species, why this ecological devastation, why the pitfalls and nihilism of postmodernism. And they will say that you have divorced yourself from spirit. Here we have McKenna saying the world is in crisis because of an absence of consciousness, that we need to see what we're doing, even if that's really ugly. And that the world needs to know, we, you, I need to know what's going on. And it's not that we are incapable, it's that we don't want to. That is why these people have been killed. We don't want to know. We wish to continue in what the Hindus call Maya. We wish to continue in illusion. So, for those that are spiritual seekers, for those that are fascinated in the questions of consciousness in physics or whatever discipline, philosophy, in questions of empiricism versus rationalism, free will, determinism, all these things that are tied to, it's all to say that to be a good person, and I use that term very loosely because good is a very nebulous term, but that we need to be aware of ourselves, aware of the implications. And it's not to bat your head against how powerless you are, but it's to say that we need to embrace awareness, consciousness, spirit, soul, embrace these different ways of facilitating it, dance, meditation, reflection. I mean, whatever, they're all different ways to reach that state of being. But this is where it needs to go. This is where we became lost. This is a topic that has been batting us on the head through various religions of the past, through modern dilemmas of fundamental, the carpet ripping out under the floorboards of science and physics. This is a thing that will and needs to be faced in some capacity. Now, I don't want to seem as though I'm on a soapbox preaching here, but it's just to say that in a lens of looking at all the spiritual traditions that we've been looking at, or a lens to look at the state of the world, or a lens to look at the progress per se of science, or anything for that matter, we can always use this measuring stick. We can always become better attuned to who is really there. How many people around you are present, are capable of being there with you in person, in conscious, instead of being pure self-seeking instinctiveness. I mean, this is deep stuff. But before I ramble on too much, I'm going to close it at that.